When I was in 8th grade, I was fixing up my old bike. And it's just one that I had for quite a while, and it had kind of gotten rusty and, things. And so I was cleaning it up. I was fixing it up. I got new handlebars. I got a new seat. I got new tires. The only thing that I was missing was different wheels. And back then, the big thing was those mag wheels. They were fiberglass, and actually they were yellow, which is kind of funny. But anyways, that was the big deal back then. If you had a cool bike, you had those yellow fiberglass mag wheels. And all I had was those metal spokes. And so anyways, one day I was at school and I was talking to a guy I knew, and he said he had a set. He had a pair of wheels, and he told me he would sell them to me. And he gave me this great price, and I was like, all right. And so we made the deal, and then the next day he brought the wheels, and I brought the money. We exchanged. I took the wheels home. I put them on my bike. I was so excited. I went to put the tires on, and when I put the air in the tire just popped off the back rim. And I must have done something wrong. So I let the air out. I made sure everything was right, put the air in the tire, and it popped off the rim. And after closer inspection, I realized that he had gone and he had ridden on the bike without tires and had worn that rim down to where it was no longer usable. And so this great deal I got was, too good to be true. And this great deal I got was actually not a deal at all. And I went back to school and I was upset. And I wasn't happy about it. I was disappointed. I was embarrassed. I was upset. I'll be honest, I was mad. And I went and I tried to get him to give my money back. I said, these are ruined. You ruined them. You lied to me. But it was no doing it. He wasn't giving me my money back. It was gone. And I told you I wasn't happy about it. And I think that's kind of understandable that someone would not be happy about being deceived like that. But I'm sorry to say that my response was not very godly. And the way I responded to him did not bring honor to my God. I'm not going to get into what I did, because it doesn't honor God. But what happens when we are faced with deception? I mean, sometimes when people try and deceive us, sometimes we're fooled and sometimes we're not. But I want to think even beyond that and think further about this deception. Sometimes this deception, what happens when we're deceived? Sometimes the deception is not just about getting caught in someone's scheme or falling for someone's scheme and getting taken by someone. But sometimes this deception comes in the forms of ideas, making us think ideas that are not right or not true. Sometimes this deception comes in the form of causing us to have desires that are not godly. Sometimes this deception causes us to disobey God. And so when we are faced with deception, are you prepared for it? And if you are deceived, how then do you respond? Well, in Joshua chapter 9, we're going to pick up Israel's story again. But before we do, we need to remember what had just happened. If you remember last week, we looked at it. Israel had disobeyed God. Achan had sinned and taken some of the things that God had told them not to take. Joshua then and the army of Israel went up and attacked Ai without consulting God and were defeated, and then came back and complained to God and said, why did this happen? And God said, well, there's sin in the camp, basically. You need to deal with the sin. They had to deal with the sin, and once they did, then they went and they were given the victory over the city of Ai. So now we come here to Joshua chapter 9, and we see in verse 1 and 2 what is happening. Joshua chapter 9 verses 1-2 says, as soon as all the kings who were beyond the Jordan in the hill country and in the lowland all along the coast of the great sea towards Lebanon, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites heard of this, they gathered together as one to fight against Joshua and Israel. So the people of the land hear what has happened and they get all up in arms. Literally. They are ready for battle. And see, they had heard all about Israel and all about what God, their God, had been doing for them for years. They've heard about Egypt and about crossing the Red Sea. They've heard these things for years. But now Israel is here in the land, and it is inevitable that they are going to come further and come into our area, is what the guys are thinking. And so several of these groups then come together and they agree that Israel must be stopped, because they know that God has given the land to them, or has told them that He's going to give them land. So they all come together and say, we have to stop. But there's one group that has a different idea. And we see this in verse 3 through 6. It says, "But when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and to Ai, they on their part acted with cunning, and went and made ready provisions, and took worn out sacks for their donkeys, and wineskins worn out and torn and mended, with worn out patched sandals on their feet, and worn out clothes. And all their provisions were dry and crumbly. And they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal, and said to him and to the men of Israel, We have come from a distant country, so now make a covenant with us." And so these people have this idea. They have heard the same things as the other people, but they realize that Israel can't be stopped. In fact, later we will read that they knew that Yahweh, Israel's God, had told them to take the land and to destroy the inhabitants, that God was judging the people, but to destroy these inhabitants of the land. And the people of Gibeon are afraid of dying. You see, they know they're doomed. They expect God to win these battles. And so they try a different tact. Not attack, but deceive. They decide to pull off this elaborate deception. And so they dress up in their worst clothes. They get out their old, worn out, holy clothes. Sandals that have been worn way too many days and have been patched. And they get out their worn out bags. And they get their wineskins that have been used and have broken, have been sewed back together. And so they look like they're really, really old. And they put all this stuff on it. And they get their bread that is crumbling and dried out, in order to look like they were from far away and they've been traveling for a long time. And then when they get to Joshua, they come and they tell him that they came from a faraway place, and they ask him to make a covenant or a treaty with them. And their treaty basically is, don't attack us. That's the reason for it. We want to make a treaty so they won't attack us. Now, they went through this elaborate plan to make it look like they were from far away. Why does it matter if they were from nearby or if they were from far away? Well, from the perspective of Israel, it matters. It is a big deal. And how do we know? Well, we can look back in Exodus. In Exodus chapter 34, and I'll read you a few verses. Exodus chapter 34, beginning in verse 11. 11 through 16, God is speaking to the people of Israel, and He tells them this. "Observe what I command you this day. Behold, I will drive out before you the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Take care lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants." A covenant. See, this is what they're asking them to do. Make a covenant with us. "Take care lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land to which you go, lest it become a snare in your midst. You shall tear down their altars and break their pillars and cut down their Asherim. For you shall worship no other God. For the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and when they whore after their gods and sacrifice to their gods, and you are invited, you eat of his sacrifice, and you take of their daughters for your sons, and their daughters whore after their gods, and make your sons whore after their gods." What God has told them here is, when you come into this land, you do not make a treaty or a covenant with these people. And the reason why is because if you do, then you'll start hanging out with these people, and then they're going to keep worshiping their false gods, and then they will invite you to join them in their worship of this false god, and they could deceive you or lead you away from God, from me, the real God, as he says. into worshiping their false gods. And so he says, so you don't make a covenant, you don't make a treaty with these people so that you will stay faithful to me. And so God sends them into the land and he tells them to wipe out the people because he is judging them for their sin, and he does not want Israel to take on their sins and start acting like the people who are in the land. So he says, do not make a treaty. So it's a big deal for Israel whether or not the people are in the land. Now the question is we don't know if the Gibeonites really knew this about Israel, that they were not to make a treaty with the people of the land. But they did know that God was giving them the land. And they knew that they lived in the land that God was giving to the Israelites. And therefore, if God was giving to them the land and they were to destroy everyone in the land, what's that mean for the Gibeonites who lived in the land? They were in trouble. And so they're going to try and convince the Israelites, we don't live in the land, therefore make a treaty with us so that we would be safe, we would be okay. We'll continue reading verse 7 of chapter 9 of Joshua. It says, but the men of Israel said to the Hivites, this is just another name for the Gibeonites, the Hivites, perhaps you live among us, then how can we make a covenant with you? They said to Joshua, we are your servants. And Joshua said to them, who are you and where do you come from? So you see here, Joshua and the Israelites are hesitant to make this covenant. They're hesitant to make a treaty with these people. And maybe they're a little suspicious of them at this point. And so he keeps asking them, why do you want to make a treaty with us? Who are you and where do you come from? And Joshua specifically says, it's possible you may live among us. In other words, in our land. And if you live in our land, then we can't make a treaty with you. Now, why can't they make a treaty? Again, because God had told them through Moses not to. And God had devoted these people to destruction. And so to make a treaty with them would be to disobey God. Well, the people's response, the Gibeonites' response to Joshua is very deceptive. And I'm sure that they practiced the entire time they were traveling to see Israel. They probably practiced it and went over every possible scenario. Well, what if he says this? What if he asks this? And they have answers to it all. They're ready for it. They are prepared. But their response is very deceptive because it's a mixture of truth and lie. Look at chapter 9, beginning verse 19. It says, they said to him, from a very distant country your servants have come, because of the name of the Lord your God. For we have heard a report of him and all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon the king of Heshbon, and to Og king of Bashan, who lived in Ashtaroth. So our elders and all the inhabitants of our country said to us, take provisions in your hand for the journey and go to meet them and say to them, we are your servants, come now, make a covenant with us. Here is our bread. It was still warm when we took it from our houses as our food for the journey on the day we set out to come to you. But now, behold, it is dry and crumbly. These wineskins were new when we filled them, and behold, they have burst. And these garments and sandals of ours are worn out from the very long journey. So they respond to him and they tell him this answer. But we see their response, and I said it was deceptive. How? Well, first of all, they start with they give a very direct answer. Where are you from? And it is a flat out lie. They say, we're from far away. And then they launch into this speech, which is designed to gain Joshua's favor. They tell the reason for their coming. Their reason for coming is kind of a half-truth. They said, because we've heard about Yahweh. We've heard about your God. You know, we heard about his power and how he helps Israel, how he's helped them in the past. And so we've come. And this is the same thing that Rahab had told the spies earlier, how she had heard about Yahweh and the great things he had done for Israel. And so this part is true. They have heard about God. They have heard about the things he's done. But they're coming, and when they say this, we're coming because of the name of the Lord. In other words, we're coming because he has such great fame. We've heard so much about him. But it suggests that they're coming because they respect God and they want to honor him and want to somehow be connected to him. Is there truth in that? maybe some truth. But we know that ultimately the real reason they're coming is because they're afraid. They know that Yahweh, Israel's God, is powerful, and they know that He will win any battle that He takes Israel into. And they want to be on the right side. They want to be with the winners, not the losers. And so they're coming because they're afraid and they want to stay alive. Well, then they make another statement to him. They say, "We are your servants. Come make a covenant with us." It's interesting because they're taking a humble position here. Oh, we're your servants. And they're taking this humble position, putting themselves under Israel. And likely they're here actually offering to serve them. It looks like they're asking for a treaty to be like a vassal of Israel, a vassal state of Israel. In other words, what that would mean is that in a sense they would belong to Israel. They would serve Israel and even pay tribute to Israel. But it may also assume that then Israel would protect them and keep them from harm. But ultimately, again, the Gibeonites are just trying to stay alive. And then they get to this part of their argument. Look, we can prove it that we're from far away. And they start showing them everything. Now this is again an outright lie, and it's very clever. They start showing them all the stuff that they have. Say, look at us and look at our stuff. Look how worn out and old and tattered it is. Look how it's so obvious we've been traveling for a long time. I mean, bread, you wouldn't eat bread like this, but we have it because we've been traveling for a long time. And so they tell them these things. And if you notice too, how good they are when they're telling their story. Because when they mention the places that God has conquered, they mention Israel, they mention the kings on the west side, on the east side of the Jordan. They don't mention the recent victories over Jericho and Ai, which would have given it away that they were from nearby and heard the stories that had just happened. So they play their cards really well, and they're very deceptive, and they make them think that they're from far away. Was their argument convincing? Well, apparently Joshua and Israel thought so, because look what they do in verse 14 and 15. He says, "So the men took some of their provisions, but did not ask counsel from the Lord. And Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live. And the leaders of the congregation swore to them." So it says they took their provision. In other words, they took a close look at they inspected the bread and the things, and they said, "Oh, they must be from far away." And they took the word of these men and made a covenant with them. And it says that they swore to them. In other words, they swore an oath before God to let them live. They were deceived by these men. Now, there's a couple problems here, a couple reasons why they were deceived. And the first is on a very practical level, very practical reason. These men, they deceived the Israelites based on clothes and food. That's it. Some old clothes and some old food. Nothing more. And apparently they were convincing here in their argument. But that's all they did. So the Israelites were convinced, but they weren't very wise. If they had just thought about it a little bit, they would have thought, well, these people were sent by their elders. They told us they were sent by their elders. This is an official delegation of some sort. Shouldn't they have some kind of official documentation, some kind of official something? You know, maybe something written up, maybe a signet ring, maybe some kind of seal, something? Did they do any kind of investigating further than just looking at bread and clothes? It doesn't appear so. But the other problem, and the bigger problem, is clearly stated. They did not ask counsel from the Lord. They didn't talk to God about it. They didn't seek His advice. They didn't do anything. They just simply looked at the physical evidence and said, okay. But you ask the question, why didn't they seek God? Why didn't they seek His counsel? I mean, didn't they learn anything from the incident at Ai that had just happened when they had just been defeated because they didn't talk to God? Didn't they learn anything? Well, maybe they didn't put two and two together. Maybe they said, well, this is a completely different type of situation, and they didn't really make the connections. Or maybe they just didn't think it was that big a deal. I mean, it's just a covenant. It's just a treaty. It's just a kind of a practical, mundane, everyday type thing. It's not really a spiritual issue, so do we need to take it to God? Maybe they didn't even think about taking it to God because it wasn't a spiritual thing. We don't know why they didn't consult God, but whatever the reason was, this was their great point of failure. Because they didn't talk to God about it. They didn't consult Him. They didn't go to Him and ask for counsel. The thing is, God's people must ask God for counsel. We must go to God. We need His leading on a daily basis. Not just for the big decisions, but we definitely need it for the big decisions, but also just for everyday life, so that we can live to honor Him. We are supposed to live for His honor and for His glory. That means that we need His constant guidance and His constant help in order to do that. And the other thing that I think is that we can pull here or see here is that even if you are lacking in practical wisdom, even if you are being deceived, these things can be overcome by the counsel of God. But look what happens next, starting in verse 16. At the end of 3 days, after they had made a covenant with them, they heard that they were neighbors and they lived among them. So it's only been 3 days and all of a sudden they start hearing the rumors. Hey, they just live right over there. They're not from far away. And so they've made their covenant and they start hearing these things. So they're going to go check it out. Verse 17. And the people of Israel set out and reached their cities on the third day. Now their cities were Gibeon, Shepharah, Beeroth, and Kiriath Jearim. But the people of Israel did not attack them because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel, that then all the congregation murmured against Israel, against the leaders. See, here's the funny thing, is the people of Israel, they find out they're in the land and they still want to attack them. They still want to wipe them out. But the leaders have to say no. Why? Because we swore an oath before God. So he says we can't attack them because we made an oath before God. Verse 19, but all the leaders said to the congregation, we have sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel, and now we may not touch them. This we will do to them. Let them live, lest wrath be upon us. In other words, we have to let them live because if we break our oath before God, then God will discipline us, will punish us for that. He said, so let them lest wrath be upon us because of the oath that we swore to them. Verse 21, and the leader said to them, let them live, so they become cutters of wood and drawers of water for all the congregation, just as the leaders have said of them. Joshua summoned them and said to them, why did you deceive us, saying, we are from very far away when you dwell among us? See, you can tell Joshua was embarrassed. And so he's like, why'd you say that? He's upset. Why'd you do that to me? Well, we know the answer because they were afraid. But he says, now therefore, verse 23, Joshua is continuing, now therefore, you are cursed. Some of you shall never be anything but servants, cutters of wood and drawers of water for the house of my God. They answered Joshua, because it was told to your servants for certainty that the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land from before you. So we feared greatly for our lives because of you and did this thing. And now behold, we are in your hand. You see, at this point they're saying, hey, we did it because we're afraid. But I said, but now you made a covenant with us, but we're in your hands. In other words, do whatever you feel is right. And I think they're assuming that a right means keeping the covenant that they've made with them still. But they say, do whatever you would like. Verse 25, now we are in your hand. Whatever seems good and right in your sight to do to us, do it. So he did this to them and delivered them out of the hand of the people of Israel, and they did not kill them. But Joshua made them that day cutters of wood and drawers of water for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord, to this day in the place that he should choose. So they allow the people to live because of this oath that they had made to God. Even though they've been deceived, they allowed them to live because they had made this oath before God. But as a consequence of their deception, they are now made to do hard labor. They're going to be cutting wood and drawing water and carrying water, working hard because of their lies. Now, the interesting thing about this work that they're doing, though, is that it's associated with the altar, with the tabernacle of God. What's the cool thing about that is that means that they will be exposed to the worship of Yahweh. They will be exposed to the worship of the true God. That God who they had heard about, now they will see his worship and they will be exposed to his worship. And there's two results from this. First of all, instead of Israel being then invited to the worship of their idols, they're involved in the service of the true God. So Israel, instead of being led away by these people are being led toward God and being put in the service of the true God. The other thing is though these people, the Gibeonites, will be working hard, they're actually blessed because they are blessed to be closely associated with the worship of God. And the thing about the Gibeonites is that they continued to live in Israel and to serve God for generations. In fact, later on, the tabernacle will be eventually set up in Gibeon, the city of Gibeon. And after the exile, when Israel is taken out of the land, when they start coming back after the exile, some of the Gibeonites come back and help Nehemiah to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. So we see here that the Gibeonites, they may have gotten out of being put to death by Israel, but now they're seen by traitors, by their neighbors, by the people in their region. So they're in trouble again. Back now in chapter 10, verse 1 and 2, it says, as soon as Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, heard about how Joshua had captured Ai and had devoted it to destruction, doing to Ai and its king as he had done to Jericho and its king, and how the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were among them, he feared greatly because Gibeon was a great city like one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all its men were warriors. And so here we have Gibeon and Jerusalem. Jerusalem is only about 5 miles south of Gibeon. So that means Jerusalem would be the next in line for attack after Gibeon. Well, not only that, but Gibeon was this strong city full of great warriors, and they were an important location right there in the center of the region. And so to go through Gibeon, to get into that region, you had to go through Gibeon first. They were like a strong line of defense for the entire region. But now the Gibeonites were bound to Israel. So their allegiance was to Israel. So the people of the land now see them as traitors because they've given them up. Look at verse 3 then. It says, so Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, sent to Hoham, king of Hebron, to Piram, king of Jarmuth, to Japhia, king of Lachish, and Debir, king of Eglon, saying, come up to me and help me, and let us strike Gibeon, for it has made peace with Joshua and with the people of Israel. Then the 5 kings of the Amorites and the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, the king of Eglon, gathered their forces and went up with all their armies and encamped against Gibeon and made war against it. So the king of Jerusalem, he's not wanting to sit around and wait for Israel to come and attack him. He's being proactive here, and he gathers together 4 other kings from the region. And so these 5 kings, they come together and form a coalition to fight against Gibeon. Now, they weren't coming together yet to fight against Israel. They're coming to fight against Gibeon. You know, the traitors, the one who have given the Israelites just a free path right into our neighborhood. And so they get together and they're going to fight against Gibeon. And so they quickly join together, they gather their armies, and they go and lay siege to the city and fight against the city of Gibeon. Let's keep reading verse 6. It says, and the men of Gibeon sent to Joshua at the camp in Gilgal, saying, do not relax your hand from your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us and help us, for all the kings of the Amorites who dwell in the hill country are gathered against us. So Joshua went up from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, and all the mighty men of valor. And the Lord said to Joshua, do not fear, for I have given them into your hands. Not a man of them shall stand before you. And so The thing is we were told that the Gibeonites were great warriors, but no matter how great of warriors they were, they can't stand against the great warriors of 5 armies. And so they immediately call on Israel for help. And they say, do not relax your hand, which is a phrase, and today we'd say something like, don't just sit there. In other words, don't do nothing, come help us. And they're assuming here that Israel will protect them as part of the treaty. When they said, when Israel really only promised directly, or at least what's recorded is that we'll let you live. In other words, we won't kill you. But they're assuming here, or it may apply, that it also includes not allowing other people to kill them, to let them live. But when they call for help, Joshua and the entire army of Israel, they immediately respond, and they quickly run to help, and they hurry to the battle. However, this time it appears that Joshua consulted God first, because he has an answer from God about this battle. God told him, don't fear to go. Don't fear them. He says, you go, and he says that they will be given into his hands. And then God says this word. He says, not a man of them shall stand before you. Meaning that every single one of those men who is there to fight against you will fall in battle. Not a single one will live after this battle. They will all fall in battle. Now that is a huge promise. And it is a promise of complete victory. God says, one, that he will conquer the entire region. This is the cool thing about this. There were 5 armies that gathered together to fight against the Gibeonites. The 5 armies from that entire region were gathered together to fight. And God says, I'm going to give you a complete victory over them, all of them. That means Joshua won't have to go to this city, and then to this city, and then to this city, and then to this. They're going to win this victory over the entire hill country in one battle. And God is going to give them the complete victory there. The second thing is that God is going to help them. And they will need God's help here, because they are going to be running all night long to get to the battle. They're going a great distance, and they're running uphill. That means when they get to the battle, they're already going to be exhausted, and they still have to fight the battle. So they will need God's help, and God promises he will give it to them, that he will give them a complete victory. Well, look what happens, verse 9. So Joshua came upon them suddenly, having marched up all night from Gilgal, and the Lord threw them into a panic before Israel, who struck them with a great blow at Gibeon, and chased them by the way of the ascent of Beth Horon, and struck them as far as Azekah and Makkedah. And as they fled before Israel while they were going down the ascent of Beth Horon, the Lord threw down large stones from heaven on them as far as Azekah, and they died. There were more who died because of the hailstones than the sons of Israel killed with the sword. And so here Israel comes. They've been marching all night, and they're coming quickly, and they show up unexpected. Apparently they made very good time. But they show up there unexpected. The armies of these 5 kings suddenly see them and are terrified. They're thrown into a panic. Here they are, they're out in the open. They're not hiding behind a city wall. They're out in the open, and they're vulnerable to the attack. They're unprepared for this. And their advantage that they had over the city in Gibeon, their advantage all of a sudden disappeared. And they are scared. But this is more than just normal fear of battle that's taking place here. We're told here that the Lord threw them into a panic. In other words, God caused them to become confused and to act irrationally out of their great fear. He threw them into a panic. And Israel then goes out and defeats this coalition army, and they start running away. The Israelite army pursues them and kills many, but the others who were getting away are still killed then directly by God through hailstones. And we're told here that God actually put more to death than the army. Again, we remember, why is God doing this? But he is judging this region for their sin. And he had said many years before that he would do this, because when their sin was complete, he told Abraham, Your family will go into slavery for 400 years, and then I will bring you back because the sin of the Amorite is not complete. At this point, their sin is ready to be judged, and God is judging the people. But we see here that God killed more people directly through hailstones than the people of Israel even killed in this battle. But it was a huge victory, just as promised. And now that Israel had control of the entire hill country, but this was clearly the work of the hand of God. He brought these 5 kings together as a coalition against Gibeon, and then he gave this victory to Israel of the entire area. Now, at this point in the story, it may sound as if the account is over, but we're given another bit of information about this battle. Look at verse 12 to 14. It said, at that time Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord gave the Amorites over to the sons of Israel, and he said in the sight of Israel, sun, stand still at Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon. And the sun stood still and the moon stopped until the nation took vengeance on their enemies. Is it not written in the book of Jeshar, the sun stopped in the midst of the heavens and did not hurry to set for about a whole day? There has not been a day like it before or since when the Lord heeded the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. So Joshua returned and all Israel with him to the camp at Gilgal. God had promised them complete victory. And Joshua knew that this would take quite a bit of time to strike down all of those people, all those soldiers in the army, especially because many of them were running away. And so they would have to chase them down. And not only that, it would be really hard to do under the cover of night, because then they could hide or run easily. And so Joshua prays to God. And when he prays to God, he tells the sun and the moon to stand still. In other words, sun, don't set. Stay light. And you know what happens? Just that. It happens. The sun stays in the sky. It's in the middle of the sky. So it was about noon when Joshua prayed. And it didn't set for about another day's time. Now, there have been many explanations that have been made to try and explain this event. Some people say, well, it was some kind of eclipse. Some say, well, it was the reflection of the light of the sun coming in. Others have just said simply, it's just a myth. It was just a myth made to argue against the Canaanite sun god, to show that God is more powerful than the Canaanite god. But it's clear what happened. God's word tells us. God made it happen. God performed a miracle. I mean, apparently he slowed down the spinning of the earth or something, and then stopped all the cataclysmic events that would happen if the earth slowed down. But he performed a miracle and caused the sun not to set for an entire day's time. And we're told the reason why. Because the Lord fought for Israel. He was with Israel. He was helping Israel. He was telling them, leading them, and guiding them in this process. In verses 16 through 28, we're told some more details about the kings, how they had run away and they were hiding in a cave. And then when they found them, they buried or covered them in so they couldn't get out. Finished the battle, came back, pulled the kings out. They declared Yahweh's victory, God's victory over these kings. And then they put those kings to death. And then that wraps up this story. But now I just want to take a few minutes to talk about deception and guidance. The guidance I'm talking about is from God, who we saw again today is faithful. He's faithful to his people, and he's faithful to keep his promises. The deception is obviously not from God. Sometimes it comes from people like the Gibeonites. But there is another deceiver. The deceiver is Satan, and Satan loves to deceive. In fact, I think it's probably one of his greatest tools. He deceives. I mean, why would he come straight on where it would be obvious that he's trying to get you to do something wrong? Why would he come straight head on into you when he can come around the back door and trick you into doing what you shouldn't do? He is a great deceiver. But the thing is he will use people like the Gibeonites to deceive. Think about what happened to Israel. He got Israel to disobey God. This wasn't just about a covenant or a treaty. They disobeyed God. They did exactly what God had told them not to do. They were tricked into doing it, but they did it. He convinced them to do this without even looking to God, without getting any input, without talking to God at all, without going or listening to God. And the thing is that Satan is still doing that kind of thing today. We're told that he has blinded the eyes of the world. We know that he convinces people that God's way is not the right way. And Satan will use this world's twisted ideas and this world's twisted philosophies to deceive, and he will attempt to even deceive the followers of Jesus. He will attempt even to deceive the people of God. And if he can get us to follow the views and philosophies of this world and to turn away from our God, then he has done exactly what he wants to do. If he can get us to dishonor our God and disobey our God, then he has gotten what he wants. But that means that we must always be on guard. The tricky thing about that is that we're talking about deception. We don't always know when deception is coming. We don't always know when we are being deceived. But we must be on guard for that. How can we be on guard for that? It's by taking the counsel of God. By bringing in and drawing near to God, knowing his truth, knowing his ways, knowing what he desires for us. We don't know when that deception is coming. In fact, we don't know if we may be being deceived right now. Maybe there's something going on in your life and you are being deceived. And Satan is pulling the wool over your eyes. You need to draw near to God. You have to be prepared. I have some verses. I want you just to listen to these verses, what they say about deception and how to counter it with God's guidance. Ephesians 6:11 says, "Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes, the deceptions of the devil." James 1:5 says, "If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him." If you lack wisdom, he says, ask, because God gives it, and he's not going to make fun of you for asking. He gives it. James 4:7-8 says, "Submit yourself therefore to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded." And then Paul writes this to the Corinthians. And as he writes this, he's writing from a pastor's heart. In 2 Corinthians 11, verses 2 and 3, he writes this: "I feel a divine jealousy for you, for I betrothed you to one husband to present you as a pure virgin to Christ." He says, I feel a divine jealousy, a godly jealousy. In words, I feel so strongly for you that I want to protect you. I want you to stay faithful to the God who I have brought you to. He introduced them to Jesus Christ. He shared the gospel with them so that they came to believe. And he says, I want to present you to him as a pure bride. In other words, a pure follower of him. That's why I had introduced you to the gospel. He says, and I feel this longing for you, this godly longing for you, that you would do this. And he continues on in verse 3, he says, "But I am afraid that as the serpent, Satan, that as the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ." He says, but I'm afraid that you're going to be deceived. I'm afraid that you're going to be misled away from God, away from following Jesus, away from that pure devotion to Christ. And I have to say, in the years that I've been in ministry, I've seen this happen many times. And it is one of the saddest and I think one of the hardest things I've ever dealt with as a pastor. teens and adults who I have worked with, who I have pastored in the past, who were on fire for God, who were walking with God, who were following Jesus and living for Jesus, who are not now. Who have made choices and throughout their lives, they had been deceived into making bad choices. Deceived, and they stopped listening to God. And they were led astray from that sincere and pure devotion to Christ. And sometimes you go and you talk to those people and they just won't listen. Sometimes you go and talk to those people and they are convinced that there is nothing wrong with their choices. There is nothing wrong with what they're doing. But in both cases, it is because they have stopped listening to God. They are not asking for God's counsel. The deceiver is always out there. And he is always working and looking to deceive. We are told that he roams around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. He is out there and he is always working to deceive. And he will do whatever he can to keep you from obeying God. He will do whatever he can to keep you from bringing honor to your God. To keep you from worshiping your God from a pure heart. To keep you from following Jesus. To keep you from glorifying your God. And so my challenge this morning is just straight out. Make sure you're listening to God. Make sure you're listening to God. Make sure you're seeking his guidance for your life.